So I'd ask you if you could please give your name and your title, and as to whether you want to swear an affirmation or an oath.
ANNABEL JOHNSON, New South Wales Farmers Head of Strategy and Advocacy, and I'll take the affirmation.
Thank you.
I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
James Bruce McDonald. I'm the Chairman of the New South Wales Farmers Animal Welfare Committee, a sheep farmer down in the southern tablelands of New South Wales and a retired veterinarian. I'll take the affirmation. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Ms Hashimoto.
Melinda Hashimoto, CEO, Egg Farmers of Australia. The oath. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Thank you. Ms Andre.
So good morning, Margo Andраe, Chief Executive Officer, Australian Pork Limited, and I will take the affirmation. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. And would any of you or all of you like to make an opening brief statement?
Yes, we'll all make statements. I'll start and then Jim will provide the conclusion for New South Wales farmers. So, New South Wales Farmers welcomes the opportunity to provide the farmer perspective into this inquiry into animal welfare laws in New South Wales. We thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee today. New South Wales Farmers is Australia's largest state farming organisation. We represent all primary producers, from intensive industries like pork, eggs and dairy to our extensive industries of sheep meat, wool, cattle and goats. An affinity with animals is one of the key reasons individuals are drawn to farming. Farmers have a commitment to achieving high-quality welfare outcomes. This commitment underpins what they do on a daily basis. As the primary caregivers to animals in their production systems, farmers have the pivotal role in protecting and improving animal welfare. New South Wales Farmers strongly supports the current reform process, which is assessing New South Wales animal welfare legislative framework. We acknowledge that the current arrangements are in need of reform and that a modern fit-for-purpose legislative framework needs to be developed. We look forward to closely engaging in this process and achieving an outcome that advances welfare and will ensure that the critical role of farmers in this is captured. A key part of the reform process will be enforcement. We consider that this inquiry should examine at a principal level those characteristics of an effective enforcement agency.
New South Wales farmers believe there are a number of key principles that should underpin any enforcement agency. Firstly, the enforcement agencies must be impartial and avoid conflicts of interest. Impartiality necessitates that these bodies do not engage in political advocacy, activism or public campaigns. Enforcement bodies must be focused on achieving positive animal welfare outcomes as their first priority, and not the cases that are brought to the court. Communication and collaboration between farmers, government agencies and welfare organisations lead to better outcomes. And this is clearly displayed by the recent inclusion of stock welfare panels in serious animal welfare situations. This process has been tested during the drought over the last 2 years and has been most successful. The panels have achieved positive animal welfare outcomes, and because the primary objective was to make sure the animals were looked after, they also have been possible through the collaborative process that they rely on and foster. Third, enforcement bodies must be adequately funded and resourced to carry out necessary enforcement activities in New South Wales. And finally, an enforcement agency must have a high degree of accountability and transparency in order to build and retain community trust. As recipients of public funding, it's important that enforcement organisations have publicly accessible records that explain their activities, the reasons for their actions and expenditure. This inquiry is also examining the administration of animal welfare legislation and New South Wales farmers strongly support the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries retaining the carriage of any animal welfare legislation. New South Wales DPI has the technical knowledge of welfare with their large employment of veterinarians and also the relationships and extension skills needed to ensure positive welfare outcomes. The administration sitting with New South Wales DPI is consistent with most other Australian jurisdictions where similar legislation is administered by the agricultural portfolio. We strongly oppose the establishment of an independent Office of Animal Welfare in New South Wales. We firmly believe that placing the role of administration in such a body will result in the decline of animal welfare outcomes. The body will not have the inherited knowledge, the professional skills, capacity or relationships to successfully fulfil the vital role already ably carried out by the DPI. But ultimately, New South Wales Farmers supports reform of the animal welfare legislation. We urge the committee to constructively consider and build on principles-based reform to enhance enforcement and to recognise the advantages of the current administrative arrangements.
Thank you very much. Ms Hashimoto.
Egg Farmers of Australia is the voice of Australian egg farmers. We advocate on key policy issues affecting our industry and promote egg production by providing transparent information to the public. Our organisation represents the commercial egg layer industry and has a focus around farming rather than companion animals. Funding must be at an adequate level that work can be undertaken to ensure animal welfare outcomes first and foremost, and that enforcement is based on this focus rather than simply a focus on how many prosecutions occur as being seen as an outcome of success. The Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act of 1979 in New South Wales allows that legislation is in place should the RSPCA or the Department of Primary Industries find that a person is not treating their animals correctly and are able to ensure that legislation is administered accordingly. It should be noted that egg producers are in favour of the animal welfare standards being mandatory, showing the seriousness and importance of animal welfare for egg producers and reflecting public sentiment that animal welfare is of great importance. Egg Farmers of Australia would be concerned that any move to an independent office would see a full cost recovery model and feel that the RSPCA work hard to liaise with industry should a concern come to their attention. Communication and collaboration of producer, government agency and welfare organisations leads to the best outcome. Thank you for the opportunity for Egg Farmers of Australia to contribute to this hearing today.
Thank you very much. And Ms Andre?
Thank you very much. So thank you for the opportunity to be here today on behalf of Australia's 3,700 pork producers. Our sector's 36,000 employees and all the families deriving their livelihoods from our $5.3 billion industry. Australia's pig industry has been scrutinised publicly for many years. We've embraced that scrutiny and we're proud of where the industry stands today. Not only is the pork industry judged on the health and well-being of the pigs in our supply chain, but producers, transporters and processors all know that good welfare is good business. Healthy pigs raised in an environment where the welfare needs are assured are productive and profitable animals. Producers must be commended for investing in new production and husbandry methods, making Australian pork an environmentally and ethically sustainable industry. We've reduced our carbon footprint by 70%. We've reduced our water usage by 80%, and producers are adopting technology to further make sustainability progress, including on-farm waste management and electricity generation. Our animal welfare standards and outcomes and the way we manage the well-being of sows and piglets is a journey we're proud of and one we will continue to advance. Australian pork producers demonstrate the highest level of animal biosecurity of any livestock industry in Australia. So much depends on our disease-free status in terms of our production capacity, our market access and our consumer reputation. With this in mind, it is clear that existing regulation protections to uphold, monitor and enforce animal welfare require adequate resources and appropriate penalties for welfare breaches to be applied. These measures would be more effective and desirable than any legislative changes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr Secord?
Yes, Walt Secord, Australian Labor Party. Mr McDonald, I read your submission number 66 and listened to your introductory remarks, and I see a bit of a disconnect between two of your recommendations. So you express concern about a role for animal welfare advocacy and enforcement, but then you oppose the creation of an independent office. But if you actually look at your recommendations, you seem to be actually arguing for an independent office because the RSPCA is involved in advocacy and enforcement at the same time. So I find that there's a disconnect or a conflict in your recommendations. Can you elaborate or explain that? So you're saying the RSPCA has advocacy and enforcement, shouldn't do it, but then you're against an independent office.
I'll answer the last bit about being against an independent office first. And this comes from, I was a district veterinarian at Yass between 1996 and 2013. And in the early days, where it was a court-based, prosecution-based system, and this is where I draw the parallels with the independent office, and that the RSPCA, one officer would come out, they would take photos, they would take evidence, they would then call on professional people to come and verify what they'd seen. And these professional people would very well know that what they do and see would be have to go to court for some action. So there was reluctance for a start, you know. Just naturally, that takes a lot of time. It was on the spot. There was a reluctance to be involved. And what happened was that once all this evidence was gathered, RSPCA were busy gathering their evidence and developing, giving some advice to the owner, but developing their case. The professionals would come in and know that they would have to support what they said by developing their case for court. The owner would then would know that it was going to court. They would develop their case to defend the court and what happened to the animals. So the whole reason people were there were for the animals, but the last thing that occurred was actually looking after the animals. So we have to get away from, I think, a situation where we have this authority who is hell-bent on taking cases to court because the animals are the losers. The animals are the losers. And one of the specific cases that I was certainly involved in was a man who was in mid-70s. His wife had recently passed away. He was diagnosed with early terminal cancer, a grandson who had committed suicide. Now, taking that situation and trying to take that to court and thinking the animals are going to be the priority was the last thing. So that's where I come from as far as an independent office, is that we don't want that situation. We want the animals to be priority.
And I might just add sorry,
I'm sorry, we have to clarify this answer. Yes. Mr. Sickle?
So I'm in fact even more confused after your answer than I was before. So are you saying that the RSPCA shouldn't be involved in this? They should just solely be involved in animal welfare? So then who should do the investigation and the prosecutions if there are animal cruelty cases involved? So what are you actually arguing? Because I'm actually more confused now than I was before.
So the situation now, in the last couple of years, is we have stock welfare panels for livestock. Now that is a group of, so there are representatives from the RSPCA, there's normally two. There are people from DPI and the LLS, veterinarians or livestock officers. There are police, and then there are representatives from the New South Wales farmers. So together they work out a plan that is best for the livestock, rather than it being focused on a court action.
So essentially they're doing both. You're saying that the model is that is currently, obviously you've advocated for a reform process to the Act, and I get that, but you're saying that it can do both. It is outcomes focused for the animal, and criminal proceedings
Can
follow, will follow, but you're saying under the model, especially with the stock welfare panels, you've seen success in that, in being able to do both enforcement and outcomes focused for the animal.
Yes, the priority is looking after the animal and the situation, and if there are court proceedings later on, well then that's
And you would
a second.
accept that the RSPCA undertake the court proceedings if that's required, if that's deemed an action that needs to be taken, but while all the animals are looked after and overseen by this particular panel. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. But are you, I mean, just coming back to your earlier statement and following on from Mr. Secord's question, are you aware that the RSPCA have positions and policies in relation to animal production systems? So, for example, the RSPCA has a strong position opposing battery cages, it has a strong position opposing farrowing crates, and it has strong positions opposed to certain stocking densities and other practices, yet you're saying that is the body that you would accept more than an independent body that doesn't have any particular position on any animal welfare matter. You would prefer that the RSPCA, which has these positions about animals, to run the cases rather than an independent body. I'm trying to match the two.
Sorry, Chair. Can you just clarify? Are you talking about RSPCA Australia or RSPCA New South Wales?
Both.
Both have those positions. Just stating. Okay.
And I think that's
So
why.
just for clarification, RSPCA Australia set the policies and standards and positions. All state and territory RSPCAs must follow.
Yeah, so I'll just come back to the original question and just to clarify a few things. So in our our submission, we outlined what are the 4 key principles that we see of any enforcement agency, and we didn't actually provide comment on the independent office and that being an enforcement agency. The recommendation around the independent office is we would not support that undertaking the administration of POCTA or, the revised animal welfare legislative framework, because I believe that's how the terms of reference were also drafted. It was an independent office to oversee to administer animal welfare legislation, so we wouldn't support that. In terms of
Well, I'd like to quote to you number 3 recommendation. Enforcement bodies must not engage in political advocacy or activism nor conduct campaigns to ensure that impartiality is maintained. That recommendation clearly says the RSPCA should not be the enforcement body.
And I think,
I'm quoting your recommendation.
and I think we've seen the concerns this morning around that dual role with enforcement and also having that, whether it's, say, running QA programs or, recognising the distinction between RSPCA and the Commonwealth, which really doesn't exist within, the public sphere. We do have concerns about those activities being undertaken because we do think it does undermine the public's trust and confidence. And I think it's important to, so we're only speaking about the political activism and policy that's developed in relation to commercial livestock. Commercial animals, and we've always had those concerns, and we note in our submission that perhaps it's part of the reform process that needs to be examined as something similar like Victoria, where their commercial enforcement, the enforcement in relation to commercial livestock is undertaken by someone within a body within the Department of Agriculture. So they've got a special unit that does it specifically for commercial livestock, and then there's a distinction for companion animals, performance animals, which we're not going to provide comment on because we don't have those insights. So I think that's something that needs to be examined as part of, do you draw out distinctions for enforcement in relation to commercial, in relation to performance, and in relation to companion animals? So the Victorian system seems to work quite well. Part of what you'd need to look at is making sure that you don't put it within a body within the Department of Agriculture that has a conflicting role. So our concern would be, we believe local land services can't have a dual role with enforcement. So they're a key advisory body to farmers, and you can't at the same time be providing advice while conducting enforcement.
Thank you, Ms Johnson.
These are the lessons we learned from the exercise around water.
Exactly.
Where, I stood in the parliament and said you cannot put compliance, there's a conflict here between compliance and regulation and lo and behold, within 12 months...
You were vindicated.
The minister standing up in the chamber saying, the Honourable Mick Veitch was correct, we shouldn't have done this, and we now have NRA, the access regulator, that's actually conducting those measures. So, and that's a model where it's separate to, it's been taken outside of the control of the remit of agriculture. So I guess what we've been hearing is there is a view that the legislative framework is outdated and needs review and revamping, and two, what is the process that provides greater accountability and scrutiny upon whatever agency, Independent Office of Animal Welfare or whatever, such as, maybe the animal welfare agencies have to come and sit here once or twice a year in front of a parliamentary inquiry and provide an opportunity for them to be scrutinised. But there's got to be greater accountability and scrutiny. So I guess what we're saying, particularly for Walt and I, we have a view about the Independent Office of Animal Welfare and what it would do. And I think that may not be consistent with others at this panel, to be fair, but a lot of the evidence we're hearing is that there are concerns about the accountability and transparency around the way that animal welfare is administered in New South Wales, and it needs to be reviewed. What is your comments around, from all the agencies, all the organisations, around the need to review the legislative framework in New South Wales?
I think everyone supports a review of POCTA. I think everyone can recognise that it's a piece of legislation that's almost 40 years old. It's quite prescriptive. When I say 40 years old, I'd like to be recognised that commercial agriculture actually has made improvements to the standards. We're not where we were 40 years ago. We've continued to update our model codes and have revised standards and guidelines, but the vast majority of the framework is still in existence, and it's a very prescriptive framework. It makes it difficult to make changes, and I really see the reform process is quite similar to what was achieved with the new Biosecurity Act. So with the development of the new Biosecurity Act, we've now just got a modern framework, and more of the requirements are in regulations, making it easier to change and be proactive. So I think that's going to be one of the keys that will come out of the reform process.
So just a question on the evidence you just gave. So you said that really since the 1979 Act that industry codes and codes of practice and codes of conduct have actually improved welfare welfare to a level better than what the 1979 legislation is. That's what you basically said, that the industry has actually moved forward and improved welfare standards?
Yes, model codes have been updated since that time.
Have any of those model codes removed the Section 9(1)A of the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act exemption for stock animals, that they don't have to be exercised?
Could I take that on notice?
Okay, thank you. Mr. Farraway.
Thank you, thank you, Chair. Directed to anyone, but probably in particular reps from the New South Wales farmers, wanting to go to your recommendations, in particular number one, where you recommend that DPI must remain the administrator of the animal welfare legislation in New South Wales. I'd just like you to expand on that a little bit, and in reading the submissions, we've briefly touched on stock welfare panels, but more around the expertise in DPI to be the administrator of the legislation, and also the role, which we heard it briefly from DPI yesterday, but maybe New South Wales farmers could also add the role LLS plays in all this as well, because we haven't touched much on it today.
I mean, DPI, they have the technical skills and expertise, and also the relationships both within industry and the community to be able to undertake and effectively administer POCTA. I'm going to continue to call it POCTA until it's changed. So they have the highest employment of vets. These vets are very skilled, both in terms of they provide policy advice, but also in terms of upskilling local land service to make sure that they are delivering advice that's appropriate. So there's
biosecurity.
Also biosecurity, which we see as a welfare outcome. It's about improving animal health. Better health is a better welfare outcome. So they also have long-standing relationships with industry and the community, so they can work through, say, the bushfire response or drought and come into those areas. So we have a grave concern that you've got these highly skilled group of people that understand the community, have a huge amount of trust in the community, and any move from that would be detrimental. It's also important to recognise the role of local land services, as Mr. Faraway pointed out. They play a key role in providing that extension service. So extension used to be provided by the DPI. That's no longer the case.
Still be, according to me.
Debate for another time. So what LLS, so they provide, they keep farmers up to date about best practice in terms of not only welfare but also biosecurity, feeding regimes to ensure the greatest productivity. So having that direct link in, that farmers can go somewhere to get independent advice, they're not paying for a consultant, it's very important, and building that level of trust and building the capacity of industry.
So, Ms. Johnson,
Do you have more questions?
We have seen, obviously, the Animal Welfare Action Plan was released in 2018. We heard from DPI around their 6 goals, and we also heard around information around the Animal Welfare Advisory Council, and that it is being restructured, and they would like to have more expertise to have a role. I suppose that my question is, how do you see the Animal Welfare Advisory Council integrated in the system, and also in terms of the reforms that DPI themselves are looking to undertake now? Have you been a part of that process, and what are, from as a peak body, what are your thoughts on it?
So we believe AWAC has a key role. I mean, it's an advisory council to the Minister on welfare. We were supportive of it being retained. We're also supportive of the restructure that has been undertaken. We weren't consulted on, the exact. I'll just note that we used to have sort of a rep that we put on that committee. That's no longer the case. So we were informed that changes were about to be made. We recognise the need for reform in AWAC. I mean, it covered a great breadth. It covered any welfare issues. So you could be talking about circus animals, you could be talking about companion animals, and we recognise that you don't need someone with farming expertise to be involved in those conversations. It doesn't add anything to the person involved, and they can't contribute. So we recognise the need that it needs to be more specific, AWAC, about matching the skills with the topics that are being talked about. And, we're confident that, obviously, as I noted in my opening statement, farmers are sort of the fulcrum for improvement of animal welfare at a farm level, because they're involved in welfare on a daily basis. So we're confident that someone with farming expertise and that understanding will be needed as part of the new AWAC.
That's a question I was going to ask. So my understanding of it, and I can see where you're going, right, is that when it comes to the commercial side of things and farmers, okay, it should really stay under the DPI, okay? That's separate. That's commercial. And when it comes to your companion animals as such, perhaps there should be then a separate agency to cater for that side of things.
Well, I won't comment on.
There should be a separation, from my understanding.
I won't comment on where companion animals should sit. I mean, it's not for me to comment. It's not my industry. Well, it's not industry.
But there should be a separation, if I'm correct, Ms. Johnson. That's my understanding of it.
And I think
between
that
the two sides.
And I think that's something.
Question?
No, I'm asking whether that's their point of view.
I think it's something that needs to be looked at as part of the Animal Welfare Action Plan, whether you do start to, especially around enforcement, whether you distinguish, who conducts enforcement. It might be different for commercial, it might be different companion, different for performance.
Just following on from what Lou Amato was saying, the Honourable Lou Amato was saying, do you think that that's then going to cause, I mean, if the Department of Primary Industries is overseeing, it almost becomes a self-regulating system where the DPI and the agriculture groups are then sort of working together in enforcement. Do you think that that would create more distrust amongst consumers who are already concerned about welfare?
Well, I don't.
Is that a concern of yours?
Well, absolutely. I think we noted what principles we're looking at, and a conflict of interest, whether actual or perceived, needs to be considered as part of the reform process. We don't want to have an enforcement agency where there's a perceived or actual conflict of interest. And that's right across the board, whether it's with commercial or companion animals or performance animals. I will note we don't see the DPI's role in welfare and increasing the productivity of agricultural industries as a conflict of interest. We see it as they've got a vested interest in making sure that industries are improving welfare. I mean, they've got a key role in conducting animal welfare research and in making, as I noted, making sure that that is extended out and farmers are adopting. And they also take a long-term approach, as does industry, to productivity and profitability. We
On that, I think we just need to share some answers. Miss Andre, you need to be a bit more noisy and then we'll notice, but Mick has got his eyes scanned.
We noticed. I think we're both in the firing
I
line.
think some others, other witnesses want to answer some of these questions.
Yeah, and look, we are a national body. We do represent all pig producers across the country, so we do come across the jurisdictions. We are very supportive of New South Wales DPI remain the legislative body, and that does really come to that technical skills that they've got. And the bottom line is our producers and government need to be working together for the best outcomes for the animals. We do support RSPCA having a role, and it really does link into what you're talking about around the community trust and the independence of that. So we're about building a better legislation, constantly improving based on good science, good research, but also building in those community expectations. So we don't support an Office of Animal Welfare, and we've said that at the national level. We haven't the state, it's been at the national level. And the thinking there was that the state level DPIs do have the legislative positions on this, but most importantly we were concerned the Office of Animal Welfare actually became just another red tape situation that was post the event. So you're saying the pig industry is comfortable
with a charitable organisation whose policy position on certain practices in the pig industry that are currently undertaken, such as the use of farrowing crates, a charitable organisation that has a position opposing those practices, including farrowing crates, the pig industry is more comfortable with that being the prosecutor or the enforcer of animal protection than a completely independent body?
So we support the New South Wales DPI remaining the legislation. In terms of your exact question, we don't want a body that agrees with us completely. We want to be challenged. We want to be working with them to constantly improve in line of the community standards. We won't always agree. We didn't agree on farrowing crates, but we did work with all charitable bodies on phasing out the sow stalls, as you'd be aware. So we're working together for the outcomes of the animals. So they don't always agree, but they are independent. They do have a touch with the community, but they need to be better resourced, as does the DPI.
I think the question of independence is in question in that arrangement as you're talking about. We haven't been convinced by your argument. Mr. Benazia,
I think
there are a lot of people
Mrs.
wanting to...
Hashimoto wanted to contribute.
Oh, sorry.
Abigail got skipped again.
Oh, no, I think Mark indicated before you.
But just picking up on that point.
I think we had a response first from Mrs. Hashimoto who wanted to contribute.
Okay, so just in relation to me asking whether other witnesses want to give an answer to the other questions before, and then we'll come to you and Mr. Benazia. I'm sure you'll give up that position. We've got plenty of time.
I'm told to.
Ms. Hashimoto.
Certainly, I think we're aware of the different roles, and look, there hasn't been since I've been CEO of Egg Farmers of Australia a major incident where there has been a need for us to, I guess, link in. But previously, my predecessor and certainly the RSPCA, there was a case where basically agencies were working together, which I think is really important. I guess certainly I see that. For the egg layer industry, although there are a range of production systems, certainly we're aware of particular policy positions. It's been a long-standing position of the national RSPCA around conventional cages and their positioning on that. But when it comes to the actual, I guess, inspectors coming on farm, we are very aware of their job to look after the animals, and certainly working under the legislation and working under the model code, and of course, we're working on the standards and guidelines at the moment. I would see that they're looking at the animal welfare situation of the animals rather than any policy position that their national body may have.
Would you,
Ms Abigail Boyd?
thank you, would you object to an independent office of animal welfare for all animals other than those that are used in the commercial animal industry? If that was a proposal before Parliament, is that something you would object to if it specifically excluded you?
So you're coming back to Lou's point on the split.
Yeah, I want to sort of drill down into that because
I mean, certainly we're really coming, I guess, from advocating from commercial egg lay industry from the farming sector. And as my submission said, we're not supportive of an independent office. Full cost recovery as far as having set up is, I guess the thought there that would be of concern rather than with the structures and systems that are in place at the moment. I think it would be best to look at the funding that's provided and how that's used rather than looking at setting up a new independent office.
there was a number of references made to productive and profitable animals. And as being synonymous with animal welfare from the industry's perspective. And I can understand that from the industry's perspective. But clearly, when it comes to pets, people's pets, and other types of animals outside of the industry, looking at them as being productive and profitable is clearly not the standard. Would you, I guess my concern is that standard within the commercial animal industry, whatever we want to call it, would be holding back the betterment of animal welfare outside of the industry, which is why I'm asking if your objection really is only to the aspects to do with your industry, as opposed to an objection to the idea of an independent animal welfare office externally.
Can I clarify, is this independent office, is it just an enforcement role or will it also have an administration role in the legislative framework?
I think that's up for debate, but I would understand it to have an oversight role where it would be working with whoever was doing the enforcement, whether that be a police unit or RSPCA or whoever, and ensuring that standards were being met. So it's an accountability and transparency mechanism.
But it would probably have powers of its own, but then to work with people, pretty much like other commissions. Yeah.
Okay.
Ms. Boyd, have you have...
I'm waiting for the answer.
I don't think we would have, the New South Wales farmers would have a problem in dividing those, the two, because companion animals, you can take a snapshot of what's happening and be pretty right with your thinking, but there are a lot more things going on in production animals. So I think we would be reasonably comfortable with being able to separate those out.
Just following on, I suppose, in separating it and farming productions and farming animals and putting it in context of the severe drought we're going through, how would you, what are your thoughts on how to get the best outcomes-focused result for animals and sometimes for farming communities as well that are facing the drought that do come across where welfare issues for animals? I suppose, how does it work, or what's your view around LLS and around the stock welfare panels? How do you think it's best administered? Keeping families together, but also outcomes-focused for the animal.
I think that's where, it's been critical having DPI, the administrator of the Act, and having that link into LLS. So they've been able to understand where issues might be arising and, undertake sort of pilot programs. So there was a pilot program undertaken in the north where there was cold calling of producers, because what we're finding is people become isolated and they get in decision paralysis. So it's trying to bring them back into the community. So LLS have a key role in that. In terms of stock welfare panels, what that does is it recognises the need to escalate it. It's important to recognise that before a stock welfare panel is formed, generally the RSPCA and an LLS person have been out on that property working with the farmer, and it only gets escalated to a panel when there's been a decline or they haven't been able to make progress and it's decided they need to try a different tactic. And the panels are very effective in being able to provide that circuit breaker, generally because the two-person approach isn't working. And what they do is, they go onto the property, they'll make directions about how to make those improvements. It's very clear that it's focused on welfare, those improvements that need to be made, but it's done in a collaborative sort of way.
Preventative, isn't it? You're hopefully, in a lot of cases, you would be preventing a serious issue because of the dialogue, because of the early intervention, possibly, of the stock welfare panel.
Absolutely.
I'm going to seize the call rather than seek it. It's probably going to go across all of you. We've heard submissions, and some of us have been spoken to anecdotally outside this hearing about the overzealousness of RSPCA New South Wales in how they investigate and how they treat farmers. As I guess, key representative bodies and key advocates for farming, what have you heard about this overzealousness? And I guess I'm trying to get a picture of, is it isolated incidents or is it something systemic that needs to be addressed as part of RSPCA's New South Wales culture?
So we have sort of a good relationship with RSPCA, and it's proved throughout the drought. So what we've done is, if we've ever had a member, I think it's important to recognise that farmers don't have a good understanding about how POCTA operates, and what we've found is that sometimes they've been involved in a welfare incident and they haven't understood sort of where they're up to in the process, and the key concern is, you know, are my stock about to be taken? So we've had a role, and I must say we've only had a role in 2 incidences throughout the whole, over the whole drought, where we've actually engaged with the RSPCA to say, look, you know, we've had member X, where are they up to, what do they need to be doing? In addition to that, so we've done that on 2 occasions, and they were essentially, they'd just had a direction, or they just needed to comply. They complied and the issue was resolved. So it's not something that's come up on a continual basis for us throughout the drought, I must say.
So you've never received complaints from your farmers about their cattle being seized and then being taken to the sale yards and then basically being told that there actually was no animal welfare issue, there was no prohibition issue, and by the way, you can buy some of your cattle back at the sale yards 2 days later?
Well,
that's some of the anecdotal evidence that has been presented to me.
Yes, there has been that, but in years gone by, that was certainly the case, because you could have a farmer who is maybe elderly and a young RSPCA officer. There are clashes, can be clashes, and that's you know, I've been seen those happen previously. But with the stock welfare panels, the idea is you take away those personality clashes, and you have representatives from several agencies and coming up with the best plan. Now, people could still complain about the overzealousness, but that is certainly blown way out of proportion, because you do have this panel that will look at things dispassionately and work out the best options.
Just Ms. Hashimoto.
I need to move on to Ms. Hurst, so one more go.
Oh, just Ms. Hashimoto, you talked about the cost recovery process in this potential independent authority. What's your understanding of the cost recovery process with RSPCA New South Wales? Because we've heard submissions that would suggest that outside of the fines and infringements, that they seek recovery or cost recovery by taking people to court unnecessarily through civil matters.
I guess the 19 submission, our submission was really around looking at, I guess, the levels of funding to the inspectorate and the possibility of that maybe increasing. More so around, I guess, if you look at quite often government offices, if there's already a structure and bricks and mortar in place under the RSPCA, having to essentially set that all up, there of course would be overheads and costs in relation to that. And I guess often many government agencies then need full cost recovery to be able to continue their work. So really it was around that initial setup costs and ongoing costs rather than anything to do with, you know, kind of a prosecution costing linking.
Thank you. Ms. Emma Hurst.
Thank you.
I've just got a question for the two panel members from the New South Wales Farmers. I'm just going to quote a very small section of your submission which says that enforcement bodies must be adequately resourced to ensure that they're able to undertake their role. We've heard a lot of evidence over the last, this morning and yesterday, that the RSPCA is not properly resourced to be able to fully function in their role, and the Animal Welfare League as well, who said that they were in desperate need of more funding. Would you agree that it's the government's responsibility to pay the costs incurred by the authorities in enforcing POCTA, like in the same way that they fund the police?
Well, whichever way it's funded, we need it to be adequately resourced, whether it's full cost recovery or whether charities receive the grants. One of the issues that we were experiencing in the drought was we were concerned with that welfare issues might be arising and there might not be the resourcing able to be undertaken. So I'm sure we advocated for additional funding to be provided to from the DPI to both these enforcement agencies, and that was provided. I'm sure it wasn't just our advocacy, but I'm sure the enforcement agencies were also raising these issues to make sure that they did have sufficient resources with the additional work created by the drought to make sure that welfare issues were being resolved as quickly.
Have you heard concerns that there's not enough resources and not enough funding coming from the government to the authorities?
They haven't been raised with us directly.
No. Can I just add a little bit to that? Is that I think to me it's more an issue that the enforcement agency is transparent with this, with the money coming in, their activities, because if we know, you can see that this is what they're doing, this is what they're spending it on, this is what it's costing. You can quite easily say, well, that's funded or it's not funded, rather than just asking for more money to be hidden back in a back page. But if it's out, if it's clear to everyone, transparent, well then it's an easy decision for everyone to make, I think, to say yes, they need more, or they seem to have plenty. So that's probably where I'd come from.
Okay, thank you. We've also heard we've had a lot of people submitting that one of their big concerns with the RSPCA, and to some degree the Animal Welfare League as well, the accusations that have been made is that there's no regular inspections of farming properties, and that cases of extreme cruelty weren't prosecuted. And I just want to link that into the part of your submission where you emphasise focusing on education rather than enforcement agencies prosecuting. Do you see value in POCTA enforcement agencies prosecuting cases of extreme cruelty to at least alleviate some of those concerns from the community? And do you know where, sorry, this is sort of a two-pronged question, but do you know where those concerns are coming from, given that we've had multiple witnesses giving the same evidence?
So New South Wales in no way accepts animal cruelty, and if animal cruelty is occurring, it should, prosecution should occur. I think it's also important to note that there's, as part of the reform process, that needs to look at the penalties that are being provided. So a number of years ago it did look at the penalties, and there was a discussion paper put out by DPI. So we supported the penalties, recognising the seriousness of the crime and also reflecting other jurisdictions, because New South Wales was quite a long way behind. I think sort of the concern, if they're, I'll come back to you, also asked about routine inspections, which I think is around, again, resourcing. POCTA does allow for routine inspections at the moment. They're not occurring, and I think that's a question for the enforcement agencies as to why they're not occurring, whether it's a resourcing issue, but I mean, POCTA allows for that. We don't have an issue with that. It's part of the framework. It's also important to note that industry does undertake a huge amount of quality assurance by itself. We believe that the inspectors that are used are independent, so they generally go out onto property, assess against a higher animal welfare standard than what is required under POCTA, because it's important to remember POCTA is just the minimum. QA programs are established by industry to set a higher standard, and they're generally set to make sure that consumers can purchase animal welfare products of a higher that meet a higher standard in their production, which is
now starting to head towards the end of the
Sorry.
timing. Do you have any more questions? Mr. Veach.
Good. Mr Chair, I'm just going to be a little bit cheeky here. I'm going to start. I have probably one question, but I'd actually like the three organisations' view on this question. It has been raised with this panel, both in written submission and in testimony yesterday and today. There's an issue about the complaints process with AWL and RSPCA, a grievance, like an adequate, transparent grievance process. Do you have any experience, or your membership have any experience about people trying to raise a complaint about the way they've been treated, or raising a grievance about the process that was followed when the RSPCA or AWL interacted with them? I'll start over here so we can get some other testimony, and then we'll come back to Annabel.
And sadly, my answer is very slow, very quick. Not to my knowledge. I am only 6 months in the role, but in going through the notes,
you can take it on notice and come back.
I can take it on notice.
Yep.
Okay. Yep.
Thank you.
Not that I'm aware of, but more, again, happy to take it on notice.
Come back. Yep. There you go.
No, no, there's been nothing brought to me that said people have been treated unfairly.
I'm aware of 2 instances where they've raised issues. We put that through the complaints process. It was resolved, so it didn't really, the issue was resolved. It was in relation to people not understanding where they were up to in the enforcement area. So the issue was resolved, so it didn't, they didn't come back to us.
Okay, so can you talk us through then, Ms Johnson, what was the process that you followed when you were advocating on behalf of those? And you don't need to say who they are or give them up, but just what was the process you followed?
So I contacted their chief inspector, who then contacted the person involved. Sorry, the inspector that was out on the property, and it was really just matching up the communications so that they could understand what was occurring. So I put my complaint, the person's complaint, into the chief inspector.
Okay, thank you. And my second question to the full panel is around education. As I understand it, the agencies that are legislated for responsibility in New South Wales are provided with grant funding. Essentially, it's the old block funding model where they were allocated money to do what they want, but they spend it on compliance activities. Should there be allocated funding to organisations to conduct education for society around, one, responsibilities under POCTA, and 2, around greater animal welfare standards? And again, I'll start over here.
So for society, so the general public?
Well, in your case, so should there be some money available to educate your pork growers around their responsibilities under the relevant legislative framework?
So for Australian Pork Limited, we probably see that as a role we undertake on behalf of our producers. So we see very strongly that their levy money, we return into making sure they are meeting all standards, aware of all their responsibilities.
Yep.
As we're as a national body, that's not a role that we, specifically undertake. But as far as your idea around the funding, I would see that coming through via a relationship between the agency and working with the state farming organisation.
Okay. And the state farming organisation?
So industry would undertake, as Margot noted, industry would sort of go above and beyond. I do think that there is a role for making sure that people do understand the minimum. And as I said earlier, people don't understand much about POCTA at all, especially that enforcement process. And DPI have done some work. They've created sort of videos just to explain it, but it's certainly a gap.
Yeah, so, okay, so I guess I'm drawing my experience here on the rollout of the biosecurity legislation, and again, at the time, in fact, you may well have been in the chamber, Ms Johnson, and when I said this, but I did say to the Minister across the table, you will have to spend a considerable amount of money here on educating the community about the paradigm shift that was biosecurity. If there's going to be a review of the legislation in New South Wales, the framework, and there's going to be changes, I'm just concerned there's going from where we are now, based on our experience with the biosecurity legislation, the time frame for that to take place, and the education program, it still really hasn't happened for biosecurity, by the way, but the education program that would be required to advise society of the new framework and their responsibilities under that framework. That's what I'm sort of drawing my questions based on the biosecurity experience.
Yes, I think you're absolutely correct. There needs to be considerable extension work to get those messages across. And it's not just holding 3 meetings in big centres in New South Wales or on the internet. It does need to be extensive, it needs to be localised, and it needs to be carried out by people who are respected and know the new Act.
Yep. Yep.
In terms of that, I mean, from an industry perspective, again, we're national, but we again feel we have a strong responsibility to make sure our producers are aware of that. So in terms of biosecurity and changes, they have to have on-farm biosecurity plans. They have to be updated. In answering Ms Hurst's question before, we do have an independent QA system which is audited, they are audited regularly. So we don't rely just on the system. We're actually a proactive industry that's doing that. And even in answer to your question, Ms Boyd, we aren't companion animals. We are privileged to provide a safe, reliable protein to Australians. That is our role, and we raise those animals with the best care and are constantly improving based on science, research and community expectations. So we aren't companion animals, and we've seen a recent spate of people breaking into our piggeries to put piglets on Instagram and on their couches, and those piglets have died from those interactions. So we are not companion animals. We are a protein that we provide to Australians, and we're very privileged of that. And it is around the animal welfare and the care that our producers provide. Our production methods actually allow us to do that. We are looking after our people, our pigs, and giving back to the planet.
We're now just going to have to wind it up. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Just conscious we're a bit quiet.
I just have 2 short questions. Mr. McDonald, are you a veterinarian?
I am, yes.
Yes, okay. And you live in the Yass area?
Yes.
Okay. Were you involved with the prosecution of Wally's piggery by the RSPCA?
I was not, no.
In any way at all?
Oh, well, yes, I was. I wasn't in the court case, but I was involved in inspections there, yes.
And were you retained by the RSPCA to do that?
No.
Okay. And Mr. Hashimoto, you're the umbrella body that represents the egg industry?
That's correct.
And does it include Pace Farms?
It does.
Okay. And is Pace Farms the largest egg industry in Australia, as far as you're aware?
There are a number of larger egg producers. There is I guess you could call the top tier of large producers.
Okay. And does it produce eggs under the 3 different systems, the battery cage, barn and free range?
I believe 2 of those systems, but I'm happy to take that on notice and come back to you.
And is the barn system approved by the RSPCA?
I'd have to take that on notice.
Okay. Are you aware of any prosecutions of Pace Farms by the RSPCA?
Not during my time as CEO, no, I'm not.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, at the being asked by my Deputy Chair, keeping me on the ball, would you be willing to have tabled all of your introductory statements?
Yes,
Okay,
yeah.
thank you very much.